All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning to those that are still, in the morning. We're on the 1 o'clock Eastern time here out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon titled Pension Risk Transfer 2017 Pennant Race. What's your magic number? The idea today is to give an overview of the pension risk transfer marketplace, specifically get into year-end consideration for those that are looking to buy a group annuity contract before the end of 2017, but also just generally give a recap of the market, the motivators, and give some general insight to everybody that is looking for some information on PRT. The pennant race is a baseball analogy. I'm in football mode, but when we came up with this idea, it was baseball, and we are deep in the final month of baseball here, the beginning of the pennant race. And really, when you look at a magic number in baseball, there's multiple things to consider. You can't just look at your wins or your losses. You have to look at the standings around you, the other teams. And it's actually a mathematical equation that, the remaining wins plus remaining losses of your closest competitors, your magic number. Pension risk transfer, I look at the same way. It's more than just understanding the funding liability of your plan. It's understanding what that funding liability means. It's understanding how that's affected. What are the forces that push and pull on that liability? What are your options to mitigate that liability? And what are the forces that push and pull on those options? As we know, or most of us, and for those that don't, pension risk transfer is the use of a insured group annuity contract to transition pension obligations, benefits from the plan to a qualified insurance company. See if we can get this PowerPoint going here. So that's what pension risk transfer is, and there's two ways to settle obligations in a pension plan. One is to buy a group annuity contract to take over those obligations. The other is to offer a lump sum settlement. While we will touch on lump sums in passing today, and we all know the popularity that lump sums have grown to over the last few years, we're not going to spend much time on them. Just knowing that they are one option, and fully insured group annuity contract is a secondary option. So today we're going to talk about the motivators, the activity in the marketplace. We're going to spend some time on that, understanding that some of that's going to be a recap, some of it may be new, and then we're going to get into really what to look for and best practices in conducting a PRT, and closing with a plug, or maybe this is all a big plug for Dietrich and Associates, who we are a independent expert, a specialist in pension risk transfer. It's what we do day in and day out. We help plan sponsors find insurance companies to take over their obligations and everything in between to get to that point. So, moving along here, starting with the pension risk transfer motivators. Again, some of these have been common for some time, but I think the biggest one, and the one that, well, I don't know about the biggest one, but the first one here, education and awareness. If you just look around, if you're subscribed to any kind of marketplace literature, publications, or just open the Wall Street Journal, or even in our case, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the local newspaper, you're seeing pension risk transfer everywhere. You're seeing lump sums. You're seeing de-risking in general, defined benefit plans. It's hard to miss. You may have friends that are asking you about it, being in the retirement industry or being responsible for a retirement plan. You may know people that are going through this and asking you about it. There is increased awareness. There's increased awareness in the retirement space in general. And that is because defined benefits plans are a retirement plan of the past. It's a legacy benefit in most cases. This graph, while dated, the red line shows the increase in the defined contribution model and the decrease of the blue in the defined benefit only model. The green is participants that are lucky enough to have both. We all know that the good majority of defined benefit plans are frozen, have been frozen for some time, and not necessarily being used to attract active talent or retain active employees. They've become more probably of a burden for most employers than anything. Another motivator that I think has become apparent really since probably 2008, 2009, but if we just call it the decade of the aughts, really taught us about the inherent risk in pension plans. We know about the business risk, basically from a funding standpoint, but also there's risk in de-risking or risk transfer, and doing the right thing for your participants and how that is carried out. And doing the right thing for your participants as far as holding on to a plan or not. Recent polls showed that plan sponsors and participants alike view pension risk transfer and ensuring pension benefits as a positive, because now their benefit is being guaranteed by a well-known, well-capitalized, reputable insurance company. Interest rate risk, I think we've really been feeling that for decades now. Interest rates have been on the decline, and as we know, interest rates, lower the interest rate, the higher the liability. Investment asset risk, that actually is a positive right now. The markets have been performing, and even though they've been performing, pension plan funding levels are still kind of treading water and on the underfunded side. But there is market risk. That was apparent in the fourth quarter of 2008 and earlier in 2002 with the dot-com bubble and the real estate market bubble. But those two together, interest rates and assets, call it assets and liabilities, really, there's more forces now that push and pull on them, such as we live in a global economy. What is going on around the world, whether it is what's happening in North Korea or what's happening with the European Union and some of the countries in that, or what is happening here at home with natural disasters, which is the hurricanes. There is a lot more that affects the asset and the liability of a pension plan than before. I think two of the most current, at least visible risks, pension plans, and the two biggest catalysts for pension risk transfer right now are the last two. Longevity risk, folks are living longer and we're recognizing that. Pension plans are recognizing that in multiple ways. And regulatory risk. One of the reasons pension plans are recognizing longevity is because regulations say you have to. This slide talks to the mortality change that most of us are aware of. At the IRS, this has been coming for some time. The mortality table was updated in 2014. We've been expecting it, and it is moving forward January 1st, 2018. What does that mean? That means that it's going to increase liabilities in general. We're speaking in generalities here, 3 to 5%, and that is on lump sum values, minimum lump sum values. So when you're calculating the cost to cash out a participant, it's going to increase that cost. It's going to increase your funding requirements. Most plans have already recognized it on a ABO, PBO accounting basis. Some have not, but it has been implemented there. It will be implemented from a funding perspective. And lastly, which is I think the big whammy here, is that it is being recognized when calculating your PBGC liability. There are 4 different ways of measuring liability. There's your termination, starting with the most expensive, your termination liability, your accounting liability, that ABO, PBO that I talked about, your PBGC liability, and your funding liability. They're all based on different underlying assumptions and they're being affected, all but the termination liability, because it's already in there, is being affected by this recognition of longer life expectancies in the new mortality, in the adoption of new mortality. What that is doing is increasing PBGC premiums in a compounding effect. So the other regulatory change that risk and recent change that has been affecting plans for the last 5 years is increase in PBGC premiums, specifically in the per head premium, as we're seeing here in light blue, and in the variable premium. And the variable premium is kind of the sleeping giant here. When I mentioned compounding effect and mortality being taken into account from a standpoint of calculating your PBGC liability, well, you're recognizing that people are living longer, so you have a higher liability as a result from the new mortality. And on top of that, so your PBGC liability is up, your funding has stayed the same, but your PBGC liability has gone up because of that. And then the percentage of tax or variable premium on that is also going up. As you will see here, my slide, it's hidden, but over the course of from 2013 to 2019, the PBGC premiums will increase over 500%. This has been, from what we have seen at Dietrich and Associates, the biggest reason that plans are de-risking, both through lump sums and through pension risk transfers. The chart on the right with the headers 2013, 2017, 2019 show the mortality change effect on the PBGC variable premium, as well as the variable premium rates changing. But you have a plan whose funded status in 2013 and 2017 is 95%. That funded status, just because of the change in mortality, again, assuming folks are living longer and you're paying those benefits longer, is decreasing 5%, which is almost doubling 10 times the variable rate premium from 2013 to 2019. And on top of that, the flat rate premium per head has doubled. So what are plans doing? Plans are de-risking. Plans are offering lump sums, as I mentioned earlier, to try to get participants out of the plan, give participants, specifically terminated vesteds, ones that are no longer working for the company, have anything to do with the company, try to give them control of their balances. Usually it's small balances that this is an option for. But they're also, in record numbers, as you can see here, buying annuities. They are transferring the liability from the plan to an insurance company through the use of a group annuity contract to get that liability and get those heads out of the plan. It's been a very common practice to do this in part for a specific group or tranche of participants, generally retirees, generally small benefit retirees, because you can get more heads out of the plan. But plan terminations, as I mentioned from the beginning, are still a big factor in the pension risk transfer market. The fourth quarter, as you see here, this is published by LIMRA through first quarter 2017. This shows activity in the pension risk transfer space by quarter. You can see here, typically, the fourth quarter has been the highest activity in this market, and that goes back decades. Usually that's because plans are calendar year. Plan sponsors are beginning plan terminations or deciding to start plan terminations usually in the fourth quarter of a year, commencing them at the beginning of the year and trying to wrap them up by the end of a year. That hasn't changed. What has changed, other than the increase in volume that we've seen 5 or 6 times what it traditionally is in this space, what we have seen is more of the liability being transferred at different times in the first quarter, in the second quarter, in the third quarter. If you look at the trend, it's moving from the fourth quarter to the first quarter, to the point where the first quarter in 2017 actually increased 31% over the first quarter of 2016. Excuse me. What this means is that timing of your annuity purchase, of your pension risk transfer, is key, and that it's a moving target. And what this volume means is that the final motivator that we talked about, capacity. There are capacity concerns. Plan sponsors and intermediaries alike are becoming more aware that the pension risk transfer market, insurance company appetite, and capacity is very fluid. And capacity, when you think about capacity, don't think about it from a standpoint of the insurance companies cannot take on the liability from a dollar standpoint. There's enough capacity. These insurance companies are, excuse me, multi-billion, hundreds of billion-dollar general account usually is what's being used to transfer this obligation in the small to mid-market. They're large companies. They have the balance sheet to take on the liability. What they don't have is the human capacity, the human capital to set up the group annuity contracts. If you look back to one of the headlines that we showed earlier, it said that Prudential took on 21,000 retirees. Well, they are typically doing that over the course of a few months. And the most important thing, in our opinion, Dietrich, the most important aspect of a pension risk transfer is the effect on the participant. It's that transition is smooth. The insurance companies feel the same way, and they are going to do everything in their power to make sure that when that proverbial switch is flipped, that payment is not interrupted and it's happening at the same time in the same frequency, same amount, same method that it's been happening, and that the communication process between when they've taken over the obligation and when their payments begin is transparent. So that takes people to set that up. It takes people to review that information and track any changes in deaths. So what that means is that it is a fluid market, and from a buyer's perspective, from a plan sponsor's perspective, from an intermediary's perspective, for the best interest of your clients, you have to move with the market. You have to be fluid as well, and be prepared. That leads to best practices. What is the best way to go about a pension risk transfer? What are the things to think about? And we're going to speak in general and specific to fourth quarter here. Starting with the fourth quarter, which we are approaching. We're about 2 weeks away from the fourth quarter, and it will be the end of the fourth quarter before we know it. We effectively have 90 days in order to transition liability for plans that are looking to get rid of it this year. So the first thing that when we're looking at a pension risk transfer is we're looking at what are the plan's objectives. In this case, what we're talking about is a termination. But in the case of just a settlement, if a plan is looking to settle, a little less rigid, we need to know that because that's going to affect the timing. That's going to be different. They're going to have a little bit more flexibility than a plan termination. Once we determine the objectives, we identify the data that's necessary from both the plan and the insurance company side so that we can then take it to the market and determine what the insurance company availability, i.e. the timing, and the cost of the potential risk transfer is going to be. If it is a settlement and the plan sponsor's not required to do this as a result of a plan termination, that's when the analysis begins. That's when we start looking at the feasibility of doing this cost-benefit analysis, looking at alternatives, looking at the last motivator that I didn't touch on yet, but the funding alternatives. Cost of capital has been very low. One nice thing about a low interest rate environment, for one, is it's cheap to raise capital if you're creditworthy. So we look at funding alternatives, we look at settlement alternatives, and then we transact. When doing this, you should consider, as we're showing here, a pension risk consultant. Someone that knows this market, someone that has access to this market, someone that understands the fluidity in the market has the audience, has the attention of the market, and can help position you or your client in the best possible light. Because what that is ultimately going to do is it's going to result in that key item number one. It's going to result in a smooth process, smooth transition for your participants, but it's also going to result in a cost-effective transfer. This slide's to give you an idea of the services that are being performed prior and post-transfer. We talked about this a little bit in the prior slide. Data is very important. If you are considering a risk transfer, consider your data for starters. That is what the insurance companies are using to price your liability, to determine their obligation, and it's only as good as the data. There are several steps to reconcile that data, but it's the first place to start next to understanding what your objectives and your options are. What we do at Dietrich is, after we understand a plan's objectives, is we help them understand the process, the needs, the timing, so that then they can decide, well, and the cost. What are we going to do? Are we going to remain status quo and manage the liability and monitor our options? We're going to do a partial plan termination or a settlement. That's what we've seen a lot of through lump sum offerings and tranched pension risk transfer annuity purchases, or are we going to do a full plan termination? Once that is set up, we set a timeline. I love this slide because you can't really see what's going on, but the color coding will help you understand the various phases. So first of all, it's a 27-step process that we're outlining here. The yellow is plan termination regulatory requirements. Everything else is how everything else fits in, with the green being the annuity and the orange being a lump sum if you're offering that as a result of a plan termination. So a strategic settlement outside of a plan termination, there's a lot less steps, but the timing is still critical. But with a plan termination, it's even more important, and as we get into the fourth quarter here, very important, with only 90 or so days to transition the liability, to understand where everything plugs in, how much time it's going to take to affect this transition, and what the requirements are. We set that timeline. Once it's decided to move ahead and we can set that timeline, we can start talking about the marketplace. We talked about the access to the insurance companies. Well, we've already approached them on the preliminary side in the determining what we were going to do or when we could do it. We've kind of introduced the plan to the market. The market, each carrier has a different appetite, different requirements, which is kind of summarized here with these bubbles. And you know, if you have a mix of liability, retiring defers less than 20 million or greater than 20 million, or if you have a cash balance feature or lump sum feature to your plan, if it's all retirees or a mix of liabilities, that's going to determine your market. When we start approaching the market, there are 16 viable insurance companies. One of the nice things about a growing demand in pension risk transfer is that there is a growing interest in the insurance company space. And that's another reason that there aren't necessarily capacity concerns yet outside of the human capital. But each carrier has a different appetite, and that appetite is changing depending on the liability that they are taking on the books throughout the year, which, as we're seeing, is changing. It's not a fourth quarter. Everything happening in the fourth quarter anymore. There's activity in the third quarter that's dictating a carrier's appetite in the fourth quarter, which is dictating a carrier's appetite in the first quarter. For those that are looking at a settlement, do we do it now or do we do it in the first quarter of next year? Well, the answer is determined by looking at the different variables. Just like we talked about with the magic number in baseball, you can't just look at, you know, maybe an article that you read or a quote that you got. This market changes, and you have to be in it, and you have to have access to it to understand it and understand your options. Once we know the makeup of the plan that's going out to market, we can determine the final market of carriers and those that fit. Once we know those that fit, we review them. It is a fiduciary decision when selecting an insurance company. That decision has an underlying review requirement outlined by the Department of Labor's Interpretive Bulletin 95-1 that specifically states that an objective, thorough, and analytical search for an insurance company is required, and that decision can't be solely based on cost and ratings alone. At the bottom, there's a half a dozen characteristics that the Department of Labor suggests you look at. They're mostly quantitative measures talking about the size and capitalization of an insurance company, the diversification of not only their balance sheet, their investment portfolio that is going to be backing your obligations, but also their business lines. So if they do make a bad assumption in pension risk transfer, is it going to sink the proverbial ship? So analysis is required, and this is all part of the acclimation process of allowing enough time and setting that timeline in order to effect a risk transfer. And essentially, that's what Dietrich and Associates does. And that's what we're here today to hopefully provide some information on. This was high level. It was designed to be high level because everybody's understanding of the market is different. I didn't mention earlier, I apologize, but if there are any questions, there is a question box down below that I'll be accessing in a second. Feel free to type in any specific questions. We have about, I think, 10-15 minutes allotted time left to answer questions, and give it a second here, and then we'll start doing that. Okay, we got our first one coming in here. Don't be shy, guys. If anybody has any questions, type them in. They're anonymous. I'm not going to announce whose question is being asked. I just want to make sure that that we answer everybody's and you may have. And if you have a question, more likely than not, somebody else does as well. So the one question that I'm showing here is can you give us an idea of the current activity level? Can you quantify that? And speaking with some of the carriers last week, you know, as a general market, my understanding is that there's about $2.5 to $3 billion of liability slated to be transferred between now and the middle of November. That runs about 35 plans that are being transitioned. So that's about a plan every other day. And those are primarily the plans that I would say are over $5 million. There's a whole nother market in the under $5 million space. I would say that if, I think on average last year, there was about 7 plans transferred a week. So that's about 350 plans done in the year. That's primarily the over $5 million market. In the under $5 million market, I would say that there was about half of that. On top of the 350, there was probably another 175 plans transferred in the small space. So it looks like we're on an average in that 5 million and up market of about a plan every other day. From our perspective, Dietrich and Associates, we have had an increase in opportunity, as we usually do, post-Labor Day. We've settled 5 cases since Labor Day, transitioned 5 groups since Labor Day. One of the reasons for that is that those plans, they were terminating and they were prepared. They had a deadline of, in one case, August 1st to annuitize, and in the second case, September 1st. In one case, the annuity happened early. In the other one, it happened about 2 weeks later. The ultimate goal was to have the termination done by the end of 2017. So when you set those goals early, you allow yourself a buffer, and both plans fell well within that range. And it's a good example of anybody that is looking to terminate right now. This question was asked of me yesterday, can we terminate in 2017? As far as I know, I'm not an attorney, but as far as I know, no, you cannot. You needed a minimum 120 days to effect the standard PBGC termination, which puts you into 2018. But you should be able to wrap it up in the first quarter of 2018 with good planning and a good timeline. All right, got a couple other ones come in here. Are there any time constraints imposed by the PBGC or IRS for purchasing an annuity contract in a non-termination environment? That's a good question. What I was referring to with the 120 days, and coincidentally follows that up perfectly, 120 days is imposed by the PBGC. It is their requirement, notification requirement of a standard termination designed to notify the participants of what's going on and to allow enough time for the participants to voice any concerns or questions that they may have, and also time to clean up your data, as we mentioned earlier. Outside of a planned termination, there are no regulatory timing requirements. It is market timing, really, and transition timing. We feel that it is still a best practice to be transparent about the settlement, but from an IRS and a PBGC standpoint, no, there are no timing constraints imposed by them. So effectively, if you are a plan that is looking to settle liability for whatever reason in 2017, there is plenty of time to do that and to remove that liability from the books and recognize the effect of that in 2017. We have a plan that is going final today that is doing just that. They determined 30 days ago, after the conclusion of a lump sum window, that they had effectively have a gain because they settled the liability through a lump sum less than what they were carrying it for, and they wanted to offset that gain with the loss that a retiree annuity may generate. Over the last 30 days, we've determined the tranche of participants that would satisfy that objective, and they moved final today, and that liability will be transferred by their fiscal year end, 9/30. So settlements do not have the same restrictions that formal plan terminations do. Another question here, what are you seeing as the ratio of accounting PBO to the annuity purchase cost? It's a good question. There's been a lot of different, basically, marketing pieces, presentations done on that. And the answer to that, like it is in many situations in this business, is that it depends. It depends on the liability that you're transferring. So the ratio is going to be greater for longer duration liability than it is for duration liability. And it's also going to depend on the basis that you're using to determine that PBO versus the termination liability or the annuity purchase cost, as it's asked in the question. We have seen it where retiree liability, certain retiree obligations are settled for PBO. We have seen it where it is, and it's been widely communicated, I think from different channels, that it's 5%. We've also seen it where it's 15, 20, 25%. Again, it all depends on the liability being settled and the underlying assumptions being used to determine the PBO. That is one of the considerations, though, and that is one of the recognitions. As I mentioned earlier, the two, I guess, most costliest ways of valuing your liability are your termination liability and your accounting liability, your ABO, PBO. That gap closed. That gap was greater before the change in mortality, and that gap was greater before more scrutiny on the discount rate being used to value that liability on an accounting basis. So as a plan sponsor, or as an intermediary advising a plan sponsor, if you want to track your liability at the closest measure to termination liability, track your ABO, PBO. And be realistic with it. Use a current mortality. Use a realistic interest rate. There's been a lot of volatility that has been introduced to pension plans as a result of these changes and as a result of interest rates. And while that is reality, today, I think over the long haul, it's not necessarily reality that you need to be bouncing around like that. But what is reality is that we kind of have been in a stagnant interest rate environment, a stagnant liability environment. So recognizing that, recognizing the value of that, and by value, I mean the value of retaining that liability versus, and the cost of retaining that liability versus transitioning that liability through a lump sum or through an annuity purchase. We talked about that magic number and taking into account not just your wins and losses, but your closest opponent. When you're looking at the economic cost of maintaining your pension plan, and specifically a frozen pension plan, you have to look at your accounting liability, again being the most realistic, and the cost. Factor in your annual expense of maintaining that. And when plans have done that, and I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think this will be a conclusion here, is when plans have done that, they've realized that certain liabilities or all liabilities are more cost effectively transferred to an insurance company than they are retained because of the increasing cost of managing those liabilities. And a lot of them are recognizing the asset markets that we're in right now, the availability of capital, and basically taking those chips off the table, funding the difference, and walking away from that frozen pension plan to focus on more important things. So with that, I don't see any more questions. I hope I answered the 3 questions that we did receive. We are available. Contact your associate that you know best, or anyone here at Dietrich at info@dietrichassociates.com. If you have any specific questions, or if you would like us to take a look at your plan or perform a feasibility for your plan to understand your options, your costs of maintaining, and your cost of transfer, we'd be happy to do so. Enjoy the rest of your day, and again, thank you for joining our webinar.